thank you to all of you for coming to this event. My name is Cole Durham. I'm the president of the G20 Interfaith Forum and also the founding director of a Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. And I'm very happy to be involved in this panel. We're very thankful to Catherine Marshall in particular, who is here at Georgetown uh, and is at the Berkeley Center. And we're also grateful to the I don't know that it has a formal title right now, but the Indonesian program at Georgetown, or the that's apparently was pre-announced by the president of Indonesia when he was here. It's one way to shake up administrators, I guess, to announce a program that they haven't yet quite done. But I take it that, but we're very grateful to them for the focus on Indonesia, and we're grateful also to the others on the panel I'll introduce in a moment. Uh, I think the focus today is going to be on cross-cultural religious literacy. Uh, the specific focus is a very interesting and dynamic program that's going on in Indonesia, led by Matthias Ho, who we have with us. But this has potentially much broader implications, which we'll try to talk about as we go through the meeting. Uh, from a G20 perspective, the G20 is consists now of, it's a little bit misnamed, increasingly misnamed, because it has 19 member states, the 19 largest economies on earth, plus the EU, plus now the African Union. So it includes a huge amount of the world's economic productivity and population. And it's become increasingly, it's very informal, doesn't even have a secretariat, works from year to year. But it's become an important forum for discussing and formulating policies. It's largely connected with, since 2008, the G20 really came into its own after the 2008 crash. And so a lot of its work is focused on economics, finance, trying to avoid future 2008 crashes. But increasingly, each host country can focus on certain priorities. This year it's going to be Brazil. Last year it was India. And over the past years that we've been working with the program, uh, each year some of the country priorities line up with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals line up with goals and concerns and objectives that religious communities have had for longer than there have been nation states. So we're working at things from the angle of religion, realizing that often religion is left out of the policy perspective, but right at the core of working on religion and policy is understanding different religions. And we think that CCRL will work not only as in the SEED program here that we'll be describing in Indonesia, but has more general implications. So the way we thought we'd go at this is first we'll have Chris Seipel speak. Chris is currently the principal advisor on the Templeton Religion Trust in the Bahamas, working on Covenant Pluralism's initiative there. But he has been engaged with the CCRL initiative, and so I think it will be appropriate to have him sort of introduce things, and we'll have a presentation by Matthias Ho, who's really leading out on this program. And that will be a little bit more detailed. We'll then let Chris respond to that, and then Catherine is going to talk more generally about how this fits in. I have some, if there's anything left to say, I'll say a few things, but then we'll open things up for questions. Okay? So, Chris.
Good. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. A little bit more about my background. I was in the Marine Corps for 9 years, and then I worked for a religious freedom organization by the name of Institute for Global Engagement. Courtney from USAID was one of my colleagues. We were colleagues there. All to say that I have voices in my head sometimes between hard power and soft power. And I took away from both of those experiences the desire to engage with respect and then to execute with excellence. That's what drives the program at the Templeton Religion Trust. I was asked to be an advisor there and help start a funding initiative that we call covenantal pluralism. There are 3 enabling conditions of that: uh, freedom of religion or belief, engagement or cross-cultural religious literacy, and character development. We think that's kind of the basis for civilization. And if you can do those kinds of things, you can engage people who don't look, act, vote, or pray like you in a way that builds social cohesion, prevents extremism, and those kinds of things. Sometimes we like to say that cross-cultural religious literacy is a means to covenantal pluralism, because cross-cultural religious literacy embodies freedom of conscience, freedom of religion or belief, and character development. So what we did at the Templeton Religion Trust with Dennis Hoover, who's also an advisor to the trust. The trust is a $2 billion foundation, by the way, located in Nassau, Bahamas. It's a global philanthropy. And along with Chris Stewart, we wrote these 2 articles on covenantal pluralism and cross-cultural religious literacy, which then became the opening chapters for a book where we had 30 folks from around the world, different regions, different religions, react to the ideas. And that's free forever online right now. If you just look up the Rutledge Handbook on Religious Literacy, Pluralism, and Global Engagement, you can get those 30 chapters for free. You can download them for whatever your needs are. And that was as a gift from the Fetzer Institute. And Catherine and Matthias have chapters in that book thinking about this stuff. So that's the background. Cross-cultural religious literacy is competencies and skills about how to engage. And in so many ways, they're the lessons that we learned at the Institute for Global Engagement, working in East Asia in particular, China, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, but also Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And so there's competencies, 3 competencies, how to think, and 3 skills, what to do. There's a personal competency. What does my moral framework, my holy scriptures say about engaging the other? Then there's a comparative competency. What does the other person's holy scriptures say about engaging me? How do I understand them as they understand themselves? Not what social media tells me to say. And there's a collaborative competency. How do you think about getting something done where we live in a world where it's not if, but when you work with somebody who doesn't pray like you? Pick your topic. You have to have a partnership. And that's the reality. But then there's skills, what to do. And the skills are evaluation, negotiation, communication. You can read about it in the article, but basically all 3 of those things can be applied internally and can be applied externally as you do practical projects, because you have to get from A to B on global challenges that affect all of us, irrespective of our ethnic or faith identity. There are 2 things else that I would say about cross-cultural religious literacy. One is that it's differentiated from religious literacy as maybe understood here in America. Religious literacy, or in the State Department for that matter, nothing personal to my USAID people, but religious literacy for government officials or academics sometimes is knowledge about the other. And that's great. But cross-cultural religious literacy borrows from the field of conflict resolution. Once you enter into an environment, you're a part of it, whether you like it or not. So when I say personal competency, I have to understand what I believe and what effect I'm having on other people. Sometimes government officials don't like to talk about that because it's really about advancing policy, which always flirts with instrumentalization. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we call it cross-cultural religious literacy because culture is important. People get scared of religion, especially when there's secular fundamentalism around, and that's true of a lot of governments. And we have religion as a part of that. They are distinct but mutually reinforcing, the 2 sides of the same coin. But the competencies and skills, we intentionally use non-religious terms: personal competency, comparative, evaluation, negotiation, because we want to make this available with as many on-ramps as possible for people to have access to thinking about this as a means of engagement. The last thing I'll say, since I've mentioned USAID, is Catherine and I partnered with the office where Courtney now works in October of 2020, and we did the first ever evidence-based strategic religious engagement summit that our government has done, the American government has done. And a lot of things have since been implemented by Courtney's office. The office, I don't know what it's called now. Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. It takes a different name in every administration. But the work of the office across administration has been fantastic because it brings faith into the picture in the same way that Catherine brought faith into the picture at the World Bank in terms of development. Finally, because of my work at Templeton and because of my of this cross-cultural religious literacy, we met with Matthias a few times, and he said, "Hey, I think this will work in Indonesia." And it turns out that it does work. He'll give you all the numbers, but part of the reason it works is because of the non-religious terminology, and it's about engagement. It's not necessarily about religion. And when you can have that kind of mutual engagement, then you're also building social cohesion and preventing extremism. And that's key because nobody knows how to do that quite well in all of the, well, in any religious context, but particularly Muslim majority context. It's very difficult. So with that, I'll stop and give the floor to Matthias.
So while he's standing up, let me just say Matthias is the executive director of the Lemina Institute. This is not the only thing they do, so he's busy, but he's very connected with interreligious voices around Indonesia and beyond that in the world. But he's really carried this program to an impressive level. So go ahead, Matthias.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. And also thank you to Chris Seipel, who actually introduced me in a way, by force. No, just kidding. To this concept of cross-cultural religious literacy and covenantal pluralism when he invited me to write in the Rootlet's Handbook on religious literacy and global engagement. I think it was really an eye-opening experience for me as well to see this framework and how we can apply this in Indonesia. So I'm going to share about what we do in Indonesia, and hopefully this can contribute to our knowledge. And especially we are very grateful for the plan for the Georgetown University to have an Indonesian program. I think it's a very strategic plan, and hopefully this discussion will also provide useful contribution to that. So I think I'll start with this. I mean, the program in Indonesia was not developed based on the UNESCO guidelines, but I came across this definition. I think also helpful to understand about what we are doing in Indonesia, because the cross-cultural religious literacy in Indonesia, we developed this into a teacher's training program. So there's a guidelines on intercultural education where it says that in contrast to religious education, interfaith education aims to actively shape the relations between people from different religions. So in a way, that's actually what we are trying to do through our cross-cultural religious literacy program in Indonesia by training the teachers, is how to shape in a positive way, in a constructive way, the relations between people from different religions. And also, when the UNESCO came up with the report for about the future of education, one of the main issue that it identify is that how the world appears increasingly divided and polarized, and that there needs to be a pedagogies that foster cooperation and solidarity. So again, that's also what we actually have been developing and working on through the cross-cultural religious literacy program in Indonesia, is how to bring in the aspect of cooperation and solidarity through the framework of the cross-cultural religious literacy program. So a little bit about Indonesia. Indonesia is a pretty big country. Actually, we have 270 million people, and it's very diverse. According to the data, more than 1,000 ethnicities, more than 600 languages, not dialects, but languages, and then 16,000 islands, depending maybe whether it's low tide or high tide. I think depends on how you calculate the number of islands. So it's the world's largest Muslim population, but there is no official state religion in Indonesia. So we actually, the constitution actually protects freedom of religion, and it's not a religious state, and we are also the world's third largest democracy. We're not federal; it's actually a unitary state, and that's the composition of the religious community in Indonesia. So in a way, Indonesia, when Chris mentioned about covenantal pluralism, Indonesia is really the history of how we became a nation. Is also a journey of that covenantal pluralism, of how people are so diverse can actually get together and agree on an idea of one nation. We declared our independence in 1945, but actually 17 years before the independence, it was actually the youth leaders in Indonesia who came together. It was still under the Dutch colonial at the time, but different youth organization already with the associated to certain ethnicity and religion, Islamic Youth Organization and Japanese youth organization like that. But they got together and they declared together that they are one nation with one motherland and with one language of unity, Indonesia. So that's in a way for us, it's like the covenant of these people that they got together and agreed that we are actually one nation. And then now Indonesia as a state is based on our ideology, which is called the Pancasila or five principles. That again is the consensus of the agreement of all the people that we have this diverse nation, but we are agreed that it's founded on these five principles that unite us as one country. But of course, even though we have that history and all those covenants and the consensus as one nation, there are challenges in this diverse society. And for example, is the growing intolerance and actually religious tensions, or maybe according to the Pew Research, is what is called the social hostilities toward people of other religions. So, for example, there was a nationwide survey done in 2017 and 18, and one of the nationwide survey found out how there's a very high opinion of intolerance and radicalism among the Muslim teachers in Indonesia. Because at that time, it was actually the survey was done by the State Islamic University in Jakarta among the Muslim students, among the Muslim teachers, sorry, from primary to secondary schools. The year before that, the same center did a survey among the teachers and lecturers of Islamic religious education, and it found out that among the madrasah teachers, even the tendency even higher actually in terms of the opinion of intolerance. So that's one of the concern, and that's why we came up with this when Chris introduced me to this cross-cultural religious literacy framework. And then I was like, oh, this is actually like what we've been doing in Indonesia for hundreds of years. But this actually provide a framework or how we can look at this more systematically and develop this into a program. So what I did at the time was basically because we already had been working with some interfaith leaders, especially with the Muslim leaders in Indonesia on some interfaith activities. So I brought this framework to some of the leading Muslim scholars in our network and then introduced this to them that how about if we use this to develop a program? And they said that, of course, because this is Indonesia, this is what we are doing in Indonesia. But again, it helps because it provides a framework based on the three competencies and the three skills. In terms of, for example, the personal competency, it helps for the religious society like in Indonesia. It means that, for example, me as a Christian, I need to understand my Christianity well. It means that this framework respects religion, and it's very important in a religious society that the framework is not seen as anti-religion. Comparative competency, it also means that as a Christian, I need to understand, for example, Islam from the perspective of the Muslim. And that's very good because it means that I need to respect them, but actually by actually asking them about their religion. And collaborative competency is important because otherwise, if we are stuck only with the personal and comparative competency, maybe we're just stuck with the dialogue, which is important, but sometimes you don't go beyond dialogue. We need to go beyond dialogue into collaboration because it is when we can collaborate with people of other faiths, that's where we can really develop trust, the social capital, because then we can actually work together. So that's why the action oriented, collaboration oriented of this framework is very important for us to how to help address the growing intolerance in the society. And also another thing that we bring into this program that we do in Indonesia is what is called in social psychology as the intergroup contact theory. Basically, it's an idea of how we can provide the environment so that the majority and minority groups can meet together and address the stereotypes and the prejudice in the society. Because we see that cross-cultural religious literacy, in a way, even though it's religious literacy, it can add your maybe literacy in religion, but it's actually at the heart of it. What we are doing with this program is how to deal with the stereotypes and the prejudice in the society. And that's where this theory is actually helpful for us in designing our program. So what we do is that with the help of Templeton Religion Trust, we develop this into a training program for teachers from K to 12 actually. So we have teachers, but mostly from year 1 to 12, the teachers in our program. Um, we we divide the program into what we call the introductory course, and then also additional courses for those teachers who already graduate from the introductory course. We make it into this approach because we understand teachers are very busy, so we need to make the module into a bite size where they can take it without really impacting their working hours. So the introductory course is actually a 5 days course using a Zoom and also self-study using learning management system that we developed. Um, the idea is that we can train the teachers so that they can teach it to their students, and then they can also continuously learn about this concept later on. So we've developed this together with many partners. So we launched this in 2021. Our first class actually began in October 2021. Right now we have 22 institutional partners. Most of them actually religious and education partners, including National Mosque of Indonesia, State Islamic University, and other organization. Last year, we introduced this program actually to the madrasa teachers in 2021. So our focus for the first 2 years was mostly on Muslim teachers, but last year we began introducing this as well. We developed a module for the Christian school teachers. The Ministry of Law and Human Rights of Indonesia is also one of our partner. We are now also working in addition with this ministry, also with the Foreign Affairs Ministry as well. Now we are working the module for the Buddhist, Hindu, Confucianist, and other teachers. So the introductory course, the 1 week course, actually the curriculum is quite simple. We basically introduce the concept of cross-cultural religious literacy, and then we use the Abrahamic religions, which is Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as an example to understand about how the concept works. We take this because based on the advice from the Muslim scholars in our program, where they say that why don't you talk about Abrahamic religions, because the Quran also talks about the people of the book, which is the Christians and Jews. So this is probably the only program in Indonesia, at least at this scale, where we have not only the Muslims ulamas teaching, but also Christian pastors and also the Jewish rabbi also teaching in this course. We get a pretty good response because within 2 years, we've reached actually about 7,000 teachers, and we have a criteria for graduation. So now we have more than 6,000 teachers already graduated from 34 provinces in Indonesia. And out of the 45 online classes that we've run in this program in the 2 years. So we run the 1 week introductory course almost every 2 weeks actually. And Chris Seipel has been very kind enough to actually been teaching in the course from the course number 1 until now. I think this Wednesday he's going to teach again, because this week we have our largest class ever as well, because we have like 500 something teachers in one class right now this week running, out of 700 I think people who have registered. But that's just the introductory course. So what we do is that after the introductory course, we have additional upgrading course. For example, what we call as the workshop. The workshop is that we train the teachers so that they can develop lesson plans that incorporate the principles of the cross-cultural religious literacy so that they can teach it to their students. So this is what we do, and this is an example of the workshop that we actually developed together with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights. Is actually on strengthening religious freedom and rule of law. This is where you can see actually these teachers we have in a city where we have both Muslim and Christian teachers, so they learn together in that workshop. So they learn in teamwork, and then they also will take them to visit religious worship places that are different. For example, many of the Muslim teachers have never been to a church, and many of the Christian teachers have never been to a mosque. So we take them to have that experience. And then after that, we encourage the teachers so that they can send us the video of how they actually teach in the classroom using the lesson plans they develop in the workshop. And it's a very voluntary effort, but we are quite surprised because so far about 70% of the graduates of the workshop actually took the initiative to send us the video of how they teach in the classroom. So we are developing that again into a database so that it can be a reference for other teachers of how they can use these principles to teach. So I want to close this with a short video from what happened 2 weeks ago. I think this is a very interesting, I mean, at least for us at Lemena Institute, because this is an activity initiated by the teachers from a Christian school and a Muslim madrasa in Central Java. They initiated this activity of bringing the student leaders from the Christian schools to visit the pesantren or the madrasa, and without any influence or any facilitation from us or from anyone else. We actually found out about this by accident when one of my team was talking to one of the teacher, and they said that, oh, tomorrow we are going to have this activity. So we sent a team there and then took a video of how they did this program. So let me show, yeah, this is the video. So this is the first time for them to have an interaction like this, a program where a Christian school is actually visiting the madrasa. Um, These are the teachers from both the madrasa and Christian school teachers who graduated from our program and initiated this program. So we hope that we can continue to encourage more initiative like that. We are going to help promote this to other schools. And imagine if only like 10% of the 7,000 teachers are actually helping to have activities like this. We believe that is a way to address the growing intolerance and extremism. Thank you very much.
Well, you've now heard a little bit about the program, and now one of the sponsors of the program, Chris, can add back in if he's got anything to add.
Yeah, a few things to think about. Why is this working? That's what I keep asking myself. And I think there are a number of reasons. One, I think there is a yearning to be able to express your faith identity in its entirety without offending somebody. And in a lot of cultures, there's this polarization, and you can't fully express who you are, to include the differences, the irreconcilable theological differences with eternal consequences. At least that's what each party believes. And this framework gives an opportunity for people to express that. You don't sacrifice the substance of your belief, but you engage because of your belief. That's the beauty of it. So I think that I've seen this in other countries, but when you're able to express and talk about it, practical collaboration actually accelerates because you're not walking on eggshells anymore. Second reason I think is nobody's selling them anything. They're not saying you have to do this. People are doing it because they want to express. And I'm saying the same thing in different ways, but here's a third way of saying it. There's also self-interest. People can't even mention FORB or religious freedom in ASEAN countries in general. And that's true of a lot of places. It's received as colonialism. It's neocolonialism. It's all these things, no matter who signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 48. So don't mention the word FORB. Don't mention religious freedom. Call it professional development. It's the same thing. And that also harnesses your self-interest. And you'd be surprised by maybe you won't be, but how many people worldwide love to get that certificate. They love the certificate. And if you can have that certificate on your wall, and maybe it's got, Lemin is not an accredited academic institution, but it's got an academic institution, and then maybe an American one too, or another country. Wow, that's cool. Last thing I'll say is this. At Templeton, like at IGE, you want to give away learnings. They're not ours, they're God's. So cross-cultural religious literacy is also being implemented in Kazakhstan in the fall, in October. They're an NGO called LINK, Love Your Neighbor Community, is partnering with the Caspian University out of Almaty and working with Pepperdine University's Strauss Institute, #1 dispute resolution institute in the country for several years running at the law school there. And they're doing the same thing, but they're going to teach government officials and law enforcement. And if you live in a former communist state that is semi-authoritarian or used to be, it's good that your law enforcement know how to engage and not stereotype the other, because they've been through something like this that is not just a check the box thing that all institutions do to be more sensitive. This allows you to bring your full self and then therefore live according to your values, even as you show respect for the other person. And that's where it gets exciting, because each cultural context will take it and shape it according to their needs. It's just a framework. The local context fills it in, and Matthias has been doing it with his team, and all the partners have been doing it magnificently.
Okay, so Catherine, your perspective as one of the global leaders on religion and development, and having done a lot of work on the education area as well.
Good. Well, I thought I would start by sort of saying why we're here, what's brought us together. This week, for many of you may not know this, but some of you do, this is the week when there are a lot of people coming to Washington to talk about international religious freedom. So there's a big event at the Hilton Hotel. It starts tomorrow morning, and that's brought Matthias, Cole, and I guess Chris is also part of it in one way or another. But in any event, as a result of the fact that Matthias was here, we thought that we would organize something around this, and mainly because what is happening in Indonesia is really quite fascinating and very impressive. I think that's certainly our view, looking at it from a comparative, professional, sociological, whatever perspective. So we thought we would share the privilege of the people who've been involved. That's really Matthias and Chris, who are co-conspirators in this, the foundation, but also the person on the ground and so on. So why is this so interesting? Part of it is that the central problem that I'm working on, the Berkeley Center is very much part of it, is that we say that 84% of the world's population has a religious affiliation. In other words, it's a very big number. That's a Pew Research Center number that goes way back, and there are a variety of other numbers. Chris and I have actually argued about what the numbers actually mean what does affiliation mean? But the point is, it's very big. And yet, very large parts of discussions about diplomacy and public policy simply do not mention religion. I was at Davos 10 days ago for the big World Economic Forum meetings, and there was almost no religious element in any of the discussions coming from heads of state. It was mentioned. Interestingly, just for example, Al Gore came into a meeting on indigenous communities, and he must have mentioned the religious side multiple times. There was a very challenging meeting about what's going on with anti-Semitism. But apart from that, you really had this sense that the world leaders, 60 heads of state and so forth, really are not taking this religious world into account. So that is our mission, and I think it is something that Georgetown is very interested in. And Georgetown has a lot of connections with Indonesia, which hopefully will become even stronger in the future. But in that, I think it is important that this religious dimension, which is clearly such an important part of Indonesian culture, politics, society, that it be taken into account. So that, I think, is the sort of the broadest element of trying to translate the ideal of taking religion into account into something practical. And in that, one of the key questions is, how do you develop enough religious literacy, but also, in my case, enough development literacy or enough diplomatic religious literacy so that there can be a real communication. And that's where another actor in this meeting today comes into account, which is the G20. And the G20 interfaith is a purposeful effort going back to 2014, though in fact with the G7, G8, there have been efforts before then, to ask the question, what does religion have to do with the G20, but also what does the G20, when the summit of leaders meets this year, it'll be in November in Brazil, what should they take from the religious communities? And clearly one of the central themes that we see as the real core of the message of the religious communities together, collectively and individually, is the focus on vulnerability and the most vulnerable communities. But it gets very practical. And apart from sort of debt relief and all of the other issues that the G20 is considering, we are dealing with two very specific problems that are very relevant to this discussion here. And the first one, and I think there's some interesting elements of this, is the post-COVID and pandemic preparedness and what the COVID pandemic has done socially. I mean, to a degree, it has an element to do with the polarization, the politicization, but it also, and I think this is one element, it's forced us all accelerated going online. And so that a program like the Cross-Cultural Religious Literacy is more feasible now. But it also has put a very sharp focus on education and the failures of the education systems. Many of them predated the COVID pandemic, the failure of children to learn, but also another key objective of education is building citizenship, building character, building social cohesion. And this is a key part of that. And so the notion, and what's bringing us this quartet together, is really thinking about how can this be framed in ways that are meaningful for G20 leaders and for those who are around them. They call them the Sherpas, by the way, because there is a summit and Sherpas help guide people to the summit. But there's also another term that I love because I heard it. They're yaks, who are the people who help the Sherpas. And so you therefore have all these engagement groups of women, of business, and of civil society, and youth, and science, and parliamentarians, and so on. And so, as a member of that community, the G20 Interfaith Forum is going to try to bring these elements, what we have learned um, through the experience in Indonesia and elsewhere, other religious literacy programs into the G20 in ways. And another term of art that we use, Chris mentioned it, is SRE, which is strategic religious engagement, which is in contrast to unstrategic religious engagement, which I think is one of the unfortunate norms that people sort of tend to say, okay, well, we'll deal with this particular group or that one. And then when it's no longer meaningful, they drop it, etc. But what we're working on, and in fact, we're working with the Templeton Religion Trust also on strategic religious engagement, looking at a few countries and saying, what would it look like if, in fact, as part of the development agenda, as part of the humanitarian and peace building agendas, you really did look at and engage with different religious communities individually and collectively. So I hope that that gives you a little bit more context. We thought that the treat, the privilege of hearing Matthias, was something to organize this around. We brought Chris into it, and then brought Cole into it because of his particular interest and focus on the G20 interfaith effort, which is really to try to find the most meaningful and effective ways to bring this religious voice, the best of the religious voice, we always emphasize that, into the global agendas in ways that unfortunately they are too rarely visible.
Yeah, so let me just pick up on what Catherine was saying and add a few additional points, and then we'll open it to questions. I've been intrigued by CCRL and Matthias's work. I've actually had Matthias coming to a lot of our other G20 meetings just because he has so much spare time. No, but seriously, from my perspective, thinking about the G20 Interfaith Initiative, CCRL can and probably should be a central methodology. So what you're seeing here in his program, the program he's running, is this incredible program that's already reached about 7,000 teachers. Now, you have to think about the size of Indonesia, and that's still sort of a drop in the bucket, but still it's very impressive for any of you who have run programs like this. And it's very powerful to see how that can reach. And you saw the statistics. These are frightening statistics that the people teaching Indonesians are among the most inclined toward radicalism. This is really it's really a fairly frightening statistic. And yet, I think the experience has been that teachers at the madrasas are very open to learning about and seeing what can be done. And this has a particular interest to me about, I hate to say how many years ago, it's been almost 20 years, not quite. I was working with the OSCE on a project that came out as the Toledo Guiding Principles on teaching about religion. And we were taking a sort of human rights approach to courses that were teaching about religion. We spent all kinds of time trying to make sure we had addressed people in the Vatican adequately so they wouldn't get upset and think that this was going to be an attack on their parochial schools. Despite having many meetings with Catholics that were interacting with the OSCE, there were people in the Vatican who, as best we could tell, had not read our disclaimers, but assumed that what we were doing is a subtle relativist invasion scheme, and so we had some problems. But first of all, I can't tell you how many hours we had spent writing an introduction to explain that that's not what we were doing. Moreover, one of the things we found, and this is really relevant for how CCRL works, as Chris was saying, it's people aren't necessarily selling something. Teaching about religion is sort of an earlier form, if you will, of religious literacy. It's teaching. It's not inculcating religion. It's teaching about religion. And what we realized is that this is really much more challenging than you think. It's much different than introducing other kinds of curricula. So, for example, I could only imagine in the United States if there was a course on teaching about religion, who would teach it? At the high schools I went to, it would be the PE teachers. Why? Not because of their expertise, but because the teachers with any expertise were teaching what they were expert in. But someone had to teach it, and PE people are sort of generalists, you know. But what this underscored to me, one of the major learning points I had, is the depth of need for training and pedagogical training of the teachers, which is one of the things this program does. The reason, if you think about it, if you're a math teacher, study math in college, you learn how to teach math, you teach what you learn. If you're teaching about religion or you're teaching religious literacy, you have to know some things about your own religion, which most of us don't know nearly enough. You have to know some things about other religions, which truly we don't know enough. But also you have to be sensitive to how you teach, because you have to think about how the students in the class will react. They may be afraid, they may be silent, their parents may get angry. There are a lot of complexities. So doing programs like this has a lot of ramifications that go far beyond what you usually think of in terms of just curriculum. Now, from the standpoint of the G20, I mean, we talk about how a lot of our work lines up with the SDGs, the UN's SDGs. Do you know how many times the word religion is mentioned in the SDGs? I think we maybe found it once in one of the targets, a few times, but it's virtually absent. And this is truly remarkable, because if you think of the SDGs like fighting hunger, poverty, healthcare, education, these are things that religious communities know a lot about, know more about than most people, and are better at reaching the people who need it most and who don't get reached. And so for this aspect of things to be left out is difficult, but one of the reasons it gets left out is people are afraid to open this can of worms. They're afraid to deal with it. And a lot of this fear can actually be overcome if you can do something like CCRL. Now, I think it will be different, obviously, if you're training teachers who are teaching K through 12, and if you're doing training programs like we have done with IGE in many parts of South Asia, you're trying to reach these other places, it'll be different. When you have a different level of sophistication when you're dealing with government officials or with adult citizens. You need something different, and so there are some ways that this is going to have to be scaled up in other areas. But I mean, let me just give you a kind of practical example. I've had a lot of experience working on religion laws in different countries. This is an area where you need really deep level religious literacy, because what happens in a lot of legal change in countries, legal changes in this area is going on all the time, because religion is so central to culture and civilization that people are constantly trying to fix it. But people fix it with their with their stereotypical images of religion in mind. And they take very good faith efforts, but they miss things because they're not sufficiently religiously literate. I'll give you a practical example right now. In much of South Africa, not the country, but southern the southern half of Africa. There's a lot of concern about what are called fire churches. This may be Pentecostals, it may be others, but part of the concern is you'll have a local charismatic leader who is very charismatic, but may have some weird religious ideas, or may have a real strong interest in self-promotion, so that comes out with a lot of financial gains for himself. I mean, there are a lot of strange stories. So one kind of response has been, well, we really need to have more educated religious leaders, right? So let's insist that for a religious leader to be certified, he has to have a college education in theology or something like that. Well, this is nice, but what about, I come from a religious tradition that doesn't have paid ministers, doesn't have formally educated ministers. And what these kind of laws are doing is locking out my faith tradition from many of these countries. And that's an example of something that that a little religious literacy can be helpful. Sometimes actually legal literacy is helpful. Not long ago, Chile passed a very forward-looking, advanced religious associations law, and it was actually very popular. So all the religious groups in the country wanted to re-register under the law. This meant, however, that you had to transfer the titles of all your organizations to the new entity. And what the reformers hadn't thought about is the tax implications of those kind of shifts. Now, we contributed to the religious literacy of the people who had passed those acts by saying you really ought to add something that exempts transfers of title that are really not, they're really cosmetic transfers of title. They're transfers to the new, more appropriate legal entity. Well, what this suggests, I mean, I point these things out, this is not the kind of thing that they're going to cover in the next round of CCRL. But they're the kind of things that as we think about how CCRL as a methodology can be used in a lot of different training contexts, in a lot of contexts where people can understand and work together. This is one of the powerful things that can be done. One of the things we know, we don't know all the causal issues, but we know if you have, if you want to promote these other social goods, the sustainable development goals, it will almost always be possible to promote them better if you're in a country that has religious liberty. There are very high correlations between countries with religious liberty and a lot of other social goods. There are disputes about what's causing what, but probably the causation is complex and going in both directions. But the important thing to recognize, and this connects with the International Religious Freedom Week, if we can get CCRL to work sort of at the general covenantal pluralism level, if we can get it to work not only in these really powerful training programs that are, I mean, countries are hungry for these programs. I've been involved peripherally in a program in the Philippines that's now being adopted and mainstreamed in 20,000 schools. This will have a significant impact if we can get some of these principles mainlined in educational systems, in other kinds of training programs, training of foreign but diplomats dealing with foreign things, the people who write the religion reports for the U.S. State Department. By the way, I think one of the best things that happened with the IRF is precisely that we now have a generation of people who started out in the State Department writing religion reports, and they're now in more senior positions, but they've learned a lot about cultural literacy just by having to do these reports. I mean, I think the point is, if we can, these are principles that are not only portable across boundaries, national boundaries, but they're portable into other areas that are critical to life and religious freedom. So, well, I'll stop there. Let me just open things. We've got about 5 minutes left. But if there are any questions from the audience or be happy to take those. Professor Kim.
Okay.
Professor
Thank
Kim
you
is
very
a-
much.
A prominent interfaith
okay.
scholar from Korea.
I'm from Korea, and myself is Presbyterian Christian. Okay, so as Professor Crispo mentioned, the character formation seems to be very, very crucial among the fundamentalist groups or evangelical groups. I find that some groups very, very kind, and also they know how to cook with other people for eating together, and also eating the same message. Okay, and also among the Buddhists, I find that very, very liberal, open-minded, but I find that a lot of rigid, the doctrine-oriented Buddhist groups. Hindus also same, secularists also same. So what I'm suggesting, even among the Indonesian cases, cross-cultural, it is quite ambiguous to me, because what does the cross-cultural mean? Simply, one group, then another group, they are meeting each other. But actually nowadays, a lot of emerging groups, ambiguous groups, so-called nones, they are feeling seriously loneliness. Okay, they are seriously, yearning for being connected, but not much grammar is coming out for engaging those peoples. So when I listen to your talk in Indonesia, those participants, they are very faithful their own religious tradition, then participating in that group, or some people, they are hungry. That's why they are engaging with that aspect. So I'm just wondering how cross-cultural religious education take care of those emerging nones groups. Then why this religious education is not functioning very, very well, so-called Western countries? Secularism, fully. So deeply they are yearning, but still not much language is not yet articulated according to my feeling, my understanding. So I'm just wondering, how can we, concern for those groups? That's second very quick question about minority groups. Okay, among your groups, Muslims and Christians, and maybe Hindus, but there are so many minority groups. Okay, so how can we concern about those minority groups who are not included? So I'm just
Okay, very good questions. I'm not sure who wants to.
We only have a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Has to
So
be.
real quick on cross-cultural religious literacy, part of the idea there is that you have to make a conscious decision to cross. And in the article, leadership is about the application of these skills. So that's part of the problem, I think, overall, is that you don't have leaders who understand this, let alone who know how to apply it. I agree with you on the breaking of bread across cultures as a possible way to do these things. But I'll turn the floor to Matthias, but I think the framework is can be applied in any context. And it's nascent. It's just beginning. And the Abrahamic traditions are a place to start, if only because by the end of the century, they will be 70% of the world's population. Doesn't mean you don't engage others, but if Muslims and Christians could figure out how to get along, it'd be would be at a good starting point. So that's where you start there, but it absolutely has to include all faiths and all nones. Otherwise, it violates its own principle.
Well, thank you. I think I'll try to answer both questions maybe in one way. One of the strategy why we start actually with the with the majority group, because I think there is a need to establish the credentials as well for the program, because the whole exercise is actually a trust building exercise. We can call it CCRL or other things you want, but at the heart of it is actually building trust. And because we are being faced with the hostility, suspicion among different groups, so it's very important. That's why in terms of even selecting the partners and who we engage, all of that is actually part of convincing a larger group of why this is actually an approach that can help us address the issues. But in a way, also we open it flexibility in terms of for more creativity of how to improve this program. That's why the attempt is actually to build a community ecosystem of the teachers in the program. Now we are actually supporting the teachers to come up with their own ideas and how we can facilitate them. For example, they come up with a workshop on writings, and the teachers who are good at writing already publish many articles, for example. They teach the other teachers in our program, and we simply facilitate that. And then we help with the mentoring for the writings, and then we publish book on that. And the topic is basically about how to implement CCRL in their own circles, the teachers. So in a way, in how we come up with the grammars and how to reach the other people, actually we understand our limitations. So what we see is that how we can help the teachers understand the principles and then help them to come up with more grammars and other approach to reach out a wider group. So that's actually what we are trying to do. And we believe that if we start with the larger group and then keep going with the other groups, including the minority groups as well, I think it will create more trust as well and credibility for the program. Thanks.
So I'm sorry to say that we're out of formal time. I think the tape machines will stop. You're more than welcome, but why don't you join me in thanking our panel for their presentation?